His name is not on the filing. He was never served papers. He is not sitting at the defense table. But if you read every single line of this case carefully, Jim Bob Duggar never left that courtroom. He has been there from the beginning. And the longer this story unfolds, the harder it becomes to ignore the one person whose fingerprints are on absolutely everything without ever being officially named in anything. If this is your first time on this channel, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Jenny Exposes, because this series has been building towards something big, and you do not want to walk into the conclusion without all the context that got us here. Welcome in. Let's get into it. Most people who follow the Duggar family think they understand the structure. You have the parents, Jim Bob and Michelle. You have 19 kids. You have the courtships, the weddings, the spin-offs, the controversy. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you have Joseph and Kendra, the couple that seemed, on camera at least, like the quieter chapter in a very loud story. But here is what most people missed. And I mean genuinely missed. Not because the information wasn't there, but because the cameras were always pointed in the wrong direction. Joseph Duggar was never just a man making his own choices. He was the product of a system. And that system has one architect, one designer, one person who built the entire operating environment that every Duggar child was raised inside of. And that person is Jim Bob Duggar. Now, before anyone comes into the comments saying I'm deflecting responsibility or making excuses, stay with me. Because this video is not about removing accountability from Joseph. It is about something much more complicated than that. It is about understanding how authority works inside a closed family system, and what happens when that system finally gets close enough to a legal proceeding that the structure itself starts to show cracks. Let's build this from the ground up, because you need the full picture before the theory lands the way it's supposed to. Jim Bob Duggar is not simply a father of 19 children. He is the CEO of a family enterprise. That might sound dramatic, but it is the most accurate description of what he built. The television deals, the book contracts, the property holdings, the speaking engagements, the brand partnerships, all of that flowed through Jim Bob. The financial architecture of the Duggar family was not communal. It was centralized. And Jim Bob was the center. This is not a personal attack. This is documented. This is something that came out through years of reporting, through former family associates speaking publicly, and through the financial arrangements that became visible during the legal proceedings surrounding Josh Duggar. The money in that family did not belong to the children who earned it by being on camera. The money moved through Jim Bob. Now think about what that means for a son like Joseph. When Joseph got married, when he and Kendra set up their household, when they made decisions about where to live and how truly independent were those decisions? When your father controls the financial infrastructure you grew up inside of, when your social network is your family, when your religious community is also your employment community, the concept of independence becomes very theoretical very quickly. This is not unique to the Duggars. Family systems researchers have written about this for decades. When one figure holds economic, spiritual, and social power simultaneously, the people within that system do not experience freedom the same way someone outside it does. That is not an excuse. It is a context. And context is everything when you are trying to understand how a marriage like Joseph and Kendra's actually functioned, not on camera, but behind the scenes. Which brings us to Kendra. Kendra Caldwell came into the Duggar world young. She met Joseph through the kinds of channels that the Duggar family has always operated through: church connections, community introductions, the specific social ecosystem that Jim Bob and Michelle cultivated deliberately over decades. And when Kendra married Joseph, she didn't just marry a man. She married into a power structure that most people on the outside could not fully see because the cameras were only ever showing them what Jim Bob wanted shown. Think about Kendra's position for a moment. She is a young woman who genuinely believed in the values she was raised with. She loved her husband. She wanted her marriage to work. But the environment she entered the Duggar household, the Duggar extended family, the Duggar financial structure, that environment did not have two equal adults at its center. It had a patriarch, and that patriarch was not her husband. Jim Bob's authority in that family was not soft authority. It was not a gentle suggestion. The courtships were overseen by Jim Bob. The living arrangements were often tied to Jim Bob. The media appearances, the contractual obligations, the religious community, all of it looped back through one man. So when Kendra eventually found herself in a situation that required her to assert herself, to push back, to demand something different, who was she actually pushing back against? Here's the thing that most coverage of this story completely misses. When you are inside a system, like the one Jim Bob built, confronting a specific person within that system is almost impossible to separate from confronting the system itself. Kendra wasn't just navigating a difficult marriage. She was navigating a family architecture that was never designed to give her a voice. The voice in that architecture already belonged to someone else. Now let's talk about what started happening when legal proceedings entered the picture. Because this is where the story takes a turn that I think is genuinely underreported. Joseph and Kendra's situation has moved into territory that involves courts, attorneys, filings, and the formal legal process. And here's what's fascinating about that, from a structural standpoint. When a legal case involves a Duggar, it doesn't just involve that individual. Because the decisions that the Duggar individual made about finances, about housing, about family structure, about authority, those decisions were made inside a system. And a competent legal proceeding can follow those decisions back to their source. Jim Bob Duggar is not named in every Duggar legal proceeding, but his influence shows up in every Duggar legal proceeding. The financial arrangements that had to be untangled during Josh's case, the property questions, the contractual history, the way decisions were made inside the family, all of that pointed in one direction. And that direction was not any individual Duggar child. So what happens when a case involving Joseph and Kendra gets close enough to those same questions? What happens when an attorney starts asking not just what Joseph did, but how Joseph made decisions, who he consulted, who held financial authority, who had the final word on the kinds of choices that a married adult man should theoretically be making independently? That's when Jim Bob Duggar's shadow shows up in that courtroom. Not in person, not with his name on a filing, but in every answer Joseph has to give about the architecture of his life. And I want to be very clear about something before we go any further, because this matters. What I am presenting here is a theory. It is a theory built on publicly available information, on documented family dynamics, on legal records that have already entered the public domain, and on patterns that multiple journalists, researchers, and former Duggar family associates have identified over many years. This is not invented. This is an analytical framework applied to real events. And the reason I am presenting it this way is because I want you to be able to evaluate it, not just accept it because someone on YouTube told you to. That is what this channel is about. We don't do rumors. We don't do fabrication. We follow the pattern where the evidence leads, and we ask the questions that the mainstream coverage keeps stepping around. So here's the question I want you to sit with as we head into the second part of this video. When we talk about accountability in the Duggar story, when we ask who is responsible for what happened inside that marriage, inside that family, inside that structure, are we asking the right question if we stop at Joseph? Is Joseph Duggar a fully independent adult who made his own choices? Or is Joseph Duggar a product of a system that was deliberately designed to make independence nearly impossible? And more pointedly, if Joseph is accountable, who built the conditions that shaped Joseph? These are not comfortable questions. They are not designed to be, because the Duggar story, at its deepest level, is not a story about any one person. It is a story about what happens when total institutional authority is held by one individual for decades, and what the cost of that authority is when it finally starts to unravel in public. Jim Bob Duggar has never sat in a defendant's chair. He has never been to the named party. He has always been just slightly to the left of the frame. But every story that comes out of that family, every courtroom, every filing, every public statement, every silence leads back to the same address. And that is exactly where we are going in part 2. We are going to walk through the specific legal dynamics. We are going to dramatize very clearly labeled theory and speculation about what a courtroom examination of these dynamics might actually look like. We are going to look at what Jim Bob specifically stands to lose if the legal questions surrounding Joseph and Kendra ever expand in the direction the evidence suggests they could. And we are going to ask the question that this entire series has been building toward. How long can a shadow stay out of the light? Stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already hit that notification bell, because part 2 drops soon, and this is the one you've been waiting for. Comment below right now with this. Do you think Joseph Duggar is fully accountable for his own choices? Or do you think the system he was raised inside matters? Tell me your position. I will be reading every single one. Part 2 is coming, and it goes places this first part only hints at. Let's start with something concrete. Jim Bob Duggar's involvement in his children's lives is not a theory someone invented on the internet. It is documented across years of reporting, years of court-adjacent proceedings, and years of public statements made by people who were inside or close to the Duggar world. The courtship oversight is documented. The financial arrangements surrounding the children's television earnings are documented. The property structures are documented. The pattern of Jim Bob being consulted not just as a father, but as a decision-making authority on matters that most adult children handle independently, that pattern is documented. So when we apply that documented pattern to what is happening now with Joseph and Kendra, we are not building a theory out of thin air. We are extending a well-established line into a new chapter of the same story. Here is what I want you to understand about how power works inside closed family systems, because this is the piece that mainstream coverage consistently skips over, and it is the piece that makes everything else make sense. When one person holds financial authority, spiritual authority, and social authority simultaneously, all three at once, the people inside that system do not experience the world the way people outside it do. Every decision they make is filtered through the question of whether it aligns with the person who holds that authority. Every relationship they form exists within the network that person controls. Every conflict they experience has to be resolved within the rules that person established. This is not abusive by definition. Some families operate this way, and the people within them are genuinely happy. But it creates a specific psychological reality, and that reality is this. When something goes wrong inside that system, the person who experiences the harm often cannot clearly identify where the harm came from, because the source of the harm is also the source of everything else: the financial support, the community, the identity, the worldview. That is Kendra's position. And I want to say this carefully and clearly, because I think Kendra deserves to be spoken about with precision, not just used as a plot point in someone else's story. Kendra Duggar walked into a marriage believing she understood what she was walking into. She had her faith, she had her family's support, she had a husband she genuinely cared for. What she may not have fully understood, what many people in similar situations do not fully understand until they are deep inside it, is that the marriage was only one layer of the structure she had entered. Underneath the marriage was the family system, and underneath the family system was Jim Bob. Now, and this is important, none of that removes Joseph's responsibility for his own behavior and his own choices. An adult man who is given authority over a household used that authority in a particular way. That is on him. The environment that shaped him does not erase the choices he made within it, but it does complicate the picture. And a picture this complicated deserves to be looked at in full, not just the parts that are easiest to assign blame to. So let's talk about the courtroom. Let's talk about what it actually looks like when a legal proceeding starts pulling on the threads of a family structure like this one. What I am about to walk you through is clearly and explicitly a speculative dramatization. This is a fan theory legal scenario. This is me taking publicly documented dynamics and asking what would happen if these dynamics were examined in a formal legal setting. This is not a transcript of real proceedings. This is analytical storytelling, and I want you to receive it as exactly that. Imagine Joseph Duggar sitting at a deposition table. Kendra's attorney is across from him. And the attorney is not just asking about what Joseph did. The attorney is asking about how Joseph made decisions. The attorney asks, when you made significant decisions about your family's finances, about where you lived, how money was allocated, what your household priorities were, did you make those decisions independently? And Joseph pauses, because the honest answer to that question is complicated. The honest answer involves another name, and that name is not Kendra's. The attorney follows. When you say you consulted a family, do you mean your wife or do you mean your father? That pause, that single pause, that is where the entire Duggar architecture becomes visible inside a legal proceeding. Because Joseph cannot answer that question honestly without drawing Jim Bob into the frame. And the moment Jim Bob enters the frame in a formal legal context, everything changes. Jim Bob Duggar has spent decades being the most powerful person in a very controlled story. He has controlled which cameras came in, what those cameras showed, which questions got answered, and which questions never got asked. He has operated with the specific confidence of someone who has never had to answer for anything he didn't choose to address publicly. A legal deposition is not a camera crew. A legal deposition cannot be managed the way a television interview can be managed. And that is precisely why the possibility of formal legal examination expanding in the direction of Jim Bob's influence is so significant, not just for this specific case, but for the entire Duggar narrative. What does Jim Bob stand to lose if that examination happens? Let's be specific. First, financial transparency. The Duggar family's financial structures have always been opaque to the public. We know what TLC paid. We know there were real estate holdings. We know there were arrangements around the children's earnings that were never fully explained. A formal legal proceeding that required financial disclosure would bring a level of visibility to those arrangements that Jim Bob has never had to provide. And financial visibility in a family structure this centralized tells you a great deal about where the real power lived. Second, the question of authority over adult children. Jim Bob's position has always been that he is a spiritual guide, a father, a support system, not a controlling force. But the documented pattern of his involvement in his adult children's courtships, living situations, financial decisions, and media appearances tells a more complicated story than that framing suggests. If a legal proceeding were to formally examine the nature of Jim Bob's authority over Joseph's household, the decisions Joseph deferred to him, the ways in which Joseph's independence was structured around Jim Bob's approval, that examination would fundamentally challenge the public narrative Jim Bob has maintained for decades. Third, the Duggar brand's remaining commercial value. Yes, the flagship show is gone. Yes, Josh's conviction changed the family's public position permanently. But there are still Duggar-adjacent productions, social media presences, and public profiles that trade on the Duggar name. Every additional legal complication, every additional public examination of how this family actually operated behind the cameras chips away at whatever is left of that commercial foundation. Jim Bob understands branding better than almost anyone in the reality television space. He knows exactly what exposure costs. And fourth, and this one is the one I think matters most, the precedent. If a legal proceeding involving Joseph and Kendra expands to formally examine the Duggar family power structure, if depositions are requested, if financial records are subpoenaed, if Jim Bob's role in his adult children's decision-making becomes a matter of legal record, that sets a precedent for every other Duggar marriage that is currently or may in the future be under any kind of legal or personal strain. There are a lot of Duggar marriages. There are a lot of Duggar households, and in every single one of them, the same question exists underneath the surface. To what degree were the decisions made in that household actually made by the two people in it? To what degree was Jim Bob always the third party at the table? That question, asked formally and legally, is the one that keeps the walls standing. The moment it gets a formal answer, the moment it becomes part of a legal record, rather than just a theory discussed on YouTube, the architecture Jim Bob spent decades building becomes publicly legible in a way it has never been before. Now let me bring this back to Kendra. Because she is not a supporting character in someone else's story, she is the center of this one. What Kendra has done, and I want to say this clearly, is something that is genuinely difficult inside a system like the one she entered. She is not just navigating a marriage dispute. She is navigating the process of separating herself from an entire world that was built to make separation as complicated as possible. Her faith community, her social network, her financial arrangements, her children's relationships with their extended family, all of that is tangled up in the structure she is trying to examine honestly. And the fact that she is doing it anyway, the fact that she has moved forward into formal legal territory suggests that something shifted for her. That at some point, the cost of staying inside the system as it was became higher than the cost of challenging it. That is not a small thing. For someone raised inside the values and the community that Kendra was raised inside, that kind of shift represents a significant internal reckoning. And whatever you think about the specifics of this case, that deserves to be acknowledged. Here is my honest read on where this story goes from here. Jim Bob Duggar is not going to voluntarily step into the frame. He is going to remain exactly where he has always operated, slightly to the left of the camera, slightly outside the official record, close enough to shape everything, and far enough to avoid direct examination. That is his mode. That is how he has operated for 30 years, and it has served him well. But legal proceedings have a way of following threads that public narratives cannot control. And the thread that leads from Joseph's decisions back through the family structure, back to the authority that shaped those decisions, that thread exists. It is real. It is documented. And the question is simply whether any formal proceeding ever pulls it far enough to see where it ends. If it does, if the legal examination of Joseph and Kendra's situation ever formally reaches the question of Jim Bob's role in that household, then we will have arrived at something that has never happened in the Duggar story before. Not a scandal, not a controversy, not a public relations disaster. A reckoning. A formal, legal, on-the-record reckoning with the question that has always been at the center of this family's story. Who actually had the authority? Who actually made the decisions? And when things went wrong, when marriages fractured and children suffered, and the cameras couldn't cover it anymore, who was actually responsible? Jim Bob Duggar has never sat in a defendant's chair. He has never had his name on a filing. He has always been the man behind the frame, the one who controls what gets shown and what stays hidden. But every Duggar courtroom story leads back to the same address. Every legal thread, followed far enough, arrives at the same name. And the question this entire series has been building toward is a simple one. How long can you shape everything from the shadows before the shadows become the story? I think we are very close to finding out. Now, hot takes time, and I mean it this time. I want this debate in the comments. I am going to be down there reading every single one. Do you think Joseph Duggar is fully and solely accountable for what happened in his marriage? Or do you think the system he was built inside, the financial structure, the authority structure, the specific way Jim Bob Duggar designed that family's operating environment, do you think that system bears some portion of responsibility for what Joseph became inside it? There is no wrong answer here. I genuinely want both sides. I want the people who say Joseph is a grown man who made his own choices and the structure he came from is irrelevant. And I want the people who say you cannot separate a person from the system that built them, especially when that system was as deliberately constructed as the one Jim Bob built. Argue your case. Be specific. Be honest. This is the kind of conversation that this channel exists to have, and it only works if you actually show up for it. Here is what I need you to do right now before you click away. Subscribe to Jenny Exposes if you are not already subscribed. Hit the notification bell, not just the subscribe button, the bell, because this series is not finished, and the next video is going to take everything we have built across these 8 topics and pull it into a single line of argument that I think is going to genuinely change how you see this family's story. Like this video. Not because YouTube likes are a vanity metric, but because the algorithm uses engagement to decide who sees this content. And this content deserves to be seen by the people who have been following the Duggar story for years without ever getting a framework that actually explains what they were watching. Like the video so those people find it. Share this with someone. Specifically, share it with the person in your life who has watched every season of 19 Kids and Counting, who followed every spinoff, who knows all the names and all the courtships and all the controversies, but who has never had someone sit down and map the power structure underneath all of it. Send this to that person, because this is the video that connects the dots they have been looking at for years without seeing the full picture. And comment right now, before you go anywhere else. Tell me where you stand. Tell me what you think the next chapter of this story looks like. Tell me what question you want this series to answer next. I read everything. I respond to more than people expect. This channel is built on the idea that the audience is not passive. You are part of the investigation. The Duggar story is not over. It is not even close to over. There are threads still running, questions still unanswered, and a shadow that has somehow stayed out of the light for 30 years while being at the center of absolutely everything. Jenny Exposes is following those threads, all of them, until the full picture is visible. Stay with me. The next one is coming, and you do not want to miss it.